The Dark Star. The Dark Star 3. He woke up suddenly, his body covered with a thin layer of cold sweat, and glanced at the digital clock next to his bed. It read 3:33 a.m. for a brief moment before it silently clicked over to 3:34. He'd had the most strangely vivid dream. It had felt so real, but now that he was wide awake in his bed he couldn't remember a single detail, but the wave of emotions the dream had created echoed somewhere deep inside him. It was a mixture of deep sadness, hopeful love, and an overwhelming feeling of being lost in an unfamiliar place. A gray streak moved from the corner of his eyes, and his cat Belladonna leaped onto the bed with a quiet meow and bumped her soft head against his and began purring while kneading the shirt on his chest. She always got affectionate when she wanted food, and this was no exception. "You hungry, baby? Want some salmon?" And with those words her ears perked up, and she jumped off the bed in that graceful way cats move and looked back at him waiting. "Oh, okay. I'm coming," he said, pulling the blankets away from his legs and slipping his feet into the slippers sitting next to his bed, the dream and the feelings it had brought fading like waves pulling away from the seashore. He ran his hand through his hair and made his way to the kitchen, with Belladonna following close behind. He put the tea kettle on the stove and started boiling water to make some coffee, still trying to shake the dream from his head. He turned on his little desktop computer and pulled up the local news site, with the top story being a new rocket from the company SpaceX that had flown 5 kilometers into the air before landing back on the ground in a flash of flame, smoke, and dust. The article said the new vehicle was called Starship, and it was as big as a 747 in total volume to space, with a short video of the silver rocket landing on its tail like some 1950s comic book. Damn, he thought, why can't NASA do that? He'd always been fascinated with the stars, ever since that cold winter evening when he was a boy and his father pointed out the constellation Orion. He'd been following the live streams of the Starship testing for months, and the company's CEO Elon Musk said he wanted to begin a colony on Mars. After watching the video playing on a loop of a rocket gracefully going from horizontal to vertical and landing back on the ground, he could believe it. He'd never seen a rocket fly like that. The story below was not so hopeful though. Tensions were rising in Europe as more countries had become friendlier to the EU and the West in general than their longtime partner and patron Russia. Hard rhetoric was coming out of Moscow, and a former television star had risen to become a true leader in Ukraine. He glanced at the pictures of warplanes on the tarmac of a military base and felt queasy in his stomach. He scrolled further down the news feed to a local story about a man who had won the lottery and thought to himself, well, at least someone is having an excellent day, and closed the web browser with a click of the mouse and took a sip of his coffee. He left the house around 7:15 and took the main road across town to the old neighborhood where he'd grown up with Ben, David, and Craig, riding around on their BMX bikes as kids before they had all gone their separate ways in life. Before they had seen the lights up on the sand dunes. Ben's mother's SUV was parked at the end of the long curved driveway just in front of the double garage doors. He had thought of calling before heading over before realizing he didn't have her cell number and almost no one had landlines anymore. He parked his car next to hers, got out, and made his way up the concrete walkway to the front door. He was just about to knock when he saw her smiling face peek through the glass, her hair a fluffy wisp of gray that disappeared behind the curtain before the door swung open. "Michael, good morning. What brings you out of my way?" she asked, her sharp, clear blue eyes inquisitive as ever. "Morning, Grace," he said, stepping back as the door swung open. "Actually, I wanted to ask about Ben. David got a strange email from him, and he forwarded it to me. It's probably just some spam, but it was strange, so I wanted to stop by and say hello to see if you'd heard from him recently." "Actually, Michael, I hadn't heard anything from him since he surprised me with dinner about a month ago. Would you like to come in? I've got some fresh coffee in the pot." "Oh, I'd love a cup of coffee. I didn't know Ben was in town that recently," he replied as they stepped into the house that he'd spent so many summer afternoons in as a kid. "I was just as surprised, Michael, she said as she went into the kitchen and came back a moment later holding 2 cups of coffee. Hope cream and sugar is okay, she said. He smiled and nodded and said that sounded perfect. He took a sip of the steaming hot coffee as she told him how Ben had showed up with dinner out of the blue, hadn't called or anything, just knocked on the door holding 2 paper bags of takeout Chinese food. After dinner, he'd gone off into his old room for a while. I'll be honest, Michael, it sounded like he was looking for something. I could hear him moving old boxes and making some sort of racket in there, she said, shaking her head and taking a slow sip of coffee. What's in his old room? Michael asked, raising his eyebrows. Oh, I've kept all of his old stuff just about as he left it, she said. I just go in and clean the windowsills and dust around the room. Do you mind if I take a look? I haven't seen his room since we were kids, he asked, and she nodded to the hallway behind her. I'm sure you remember where it is, she said, and he did. Stepping into his old friend's room was like being transported back in time, old posters still hanging on the wall, though his bed was made neatly unlike the crumpled mess it had always been when they were teenagers. There was an old digital clock plugged into the wall that flashed 1:19 over and over, as if to say the room itself was lost in time. There were sports magazines sitting on the ancient computer table sporting a picture of a young Tiger Woods next to the keyboard of the old Commodore 64 computer where they played their first video games, long before the NES and The Legend of Zelda. He ran his fingers over the thick keys of the mechanical keyboard and wondered what would happen if he plugged it in. Would it even still work? Just to the left of the keyboard something caught his eye, something not from the era of floppy disks and cathode tube monitors that weigh a metric ton. Sitting to the side was a slick blue USB thumb drive with a small strip of masking tape with Ben's handwriting, or at least how he remembered it. He had written Agent Zero's mission. He remembered the game well. They'd spent hours playing it on the old Commodore. He picked up the thumb drive and stuck it in his pocket, wondering how and why it had ended up here. Had Ben left it? Forgotten it? What had he been looking for? He glanced around the room and nothing else caught his eye, just old boxes and piles of old books. He headed back out to the kitchen. Find anything in there? Grace asked, taking the last sip of her coffee. Michael shrugged his shoulders and said, I'm not really sure. I found a thumb drive and I wanted to see what's on it if that's okay. She assured him it was fine, and she walked him to the door where they exchanged hugs. It was so nice to see you, Michael. If you talk to Ben, tell him to give his mother a call, she said as he headed down the steps to his car and with a smile and a wave got into the car and backed out of the driveway.